Hi, I hope that this won't ramble too much and this will be very short, but I want to talk a little bit about stories and specifically creation stories and how these become either traditional knowledge or part of an actual ritual and why they're important. So, what we usually call mythology is actually taken from the traditional knowledge of many cultures. And because it's been sort of lifted out of ceremonies and practices, it doesn't quite have the same power to teach, but it still has some. But instead of talking about some of these ideas as psychological maps and ways of healing, I want to talk about them more in terms of how they might repair situations or help us understand the right thing to do. So I got really interested in teaching stories that in indigenous cultures, people will tell younger people the stories of how something was given to them, like the horse or the drum or things like that. And woven into the story are instructions about how you should treat that being. Well, I began to find out that there are actual stories like this in European culture. There's a really interesting one that the Druid, the Obod, the Order of Bards, Ovids, and Druid, the main, the head of that order, tells a story about dandelions, which is really about the necessity of death and how death is actually helpful, and wanting to live forever is a problem, which is a teaching in many cultures. But my favorite story about herbs, because it's so challenging, is the story of the mint plant as related in one of the Greek stories. And in this story, a mythical deity is chasing a woman that he wants to rape. And the woman is running through the wild places, and she tramples on some fragrant plants, and in the process of this, they release their odor, their fragrant medicinal odor, and she is then changed into a plant. Now, while this is really important, the really interesting teaching part of this is not the rape or the woman or the transformation, but that she is running on these plants. And the teaching story for mint is that in order to work with mint, it's necessary, if you pick it fresh off of the plant, to, besides washing it, to rub it in between your hands or put it into a mortar and pestle and mash it up a little bit. And what you're doing is you're releasing the oils this way. And then it makes a stronger cup of tea. You can chop it up and put it in your food, things like that. Now, another way to break down an herb is to cook it. But, and that is described in other stories. But it's really interesting that the actual process of releasing the fragrance and the medicinal quality of the mint and the flavor of the mint is talked about in this woman who is fleeing from a dangerous situation, and in the process of becoming a plant herself, does this action that is going to be the thing that instructs us how to work with this plant mint. Now, this is kind of a horrifying story in a way, but it shows how even within these situations where there is conflict, there's something about the mint plant that is thought to bring relief or help, and that it has to be treated a certain way in order to do this. Now, I'm not saying that this story is exactly like the Native American stories about how corn was created or how the buffalo was discovered or the horses or things like that, because it's not. But even within those stories, there are stories of conflict sometimes where the teaching is sort of woven in to the story. Another way of doing this is to think about the story of creation as it's expressed as the foundation of ritual. And there are certain rituals that are sort of like a way of understanding a story. So the first one I would like to talk about is the Andean Hierarchy. The hierarchy is sometimes called despacho in Spanish, which means to dispatch. And so it's a basic story that integrates the sacred geometry of four and the idea of reciprocity. But the idea of reciprocity here is thought to prevent the destruction of the world. And so the way the story is told, the world is destroyed 3 times because it cannot change, because there's no dynamism. So finally, in the 4th world, there is a pair of opposites. The first opposites is night and day, and the second opposites are heaven and earth. And these opposites become 4, which is the sacred number of the family and of a group of, like a village or a group of like-minded people, which is the Ayu. So the way that sacred reciprocity can be maintained is to make offerings that use these 4 directions and these 2 dynamic forces. You pair up offerings that express this. You may have offerings for the earth and then offerings for the heavens. You could have offerings that represent the sun and offerings that represent the moon, which is night. And these combinations of offerings represent not just how this sacred myth is expressed in itself, but also a prayer that balance and harmony can be brought back by representing not only this dynamism, but the idea of the Andean landscape itself, which moves all the way from the ocean all the way to the top of the mountains and the clouds that are above the mountains. And so each one of these things is moved in between and makes a powerful continuum. And they're all represented in this one offering called a hierarchy, which is then used to bless everyone present in the ritual and then burned afterwards or buried, and some of them are put in water. And there's 200 different kinds of these hierarchies. So they're very versatile, but also kind of like the basic ritual structure, which other rituals are placed on top of or worked around, because you're recreating the world every time you do it. Another ritual would be like in the Germanic traditions, the idea of the blot. In the rune poems, they say, like, for one of the letters, a gift for a gift. So it's this idea that you have to have basic sense of reciprocity going back and forth. But here you have an idea that in order to make peace between yourself and others, there has to be a type of recreation of the moment of creation, which was a conflict between ice and fire, and also a conflict eventually between 3 races of supernatural beings. The gods that sort of live and watch over human affairs, the nature beings that help human beings and other beings to grow that are domesticated, and then the wild and powerful forces which exist here for their own reasons, but that we have to interact with in order to be in harmony. And so what the bloat is doing is within these spaces, there are ways of honoring and recognizing each of these different sets of beings, and then also exchanging offerings or exchanging gifts in a way between people and between these powerful forces, so that something can be done. Now, sometimes this is a sacrifice of an actual animal, and then a collective meal is eaten later. Or sometimes it's a sacrifice of something very precious that is like a precious thing to drink, or precious food, or like produce that's been offered. There's many different ways of doing this, but and sometimes also the old poems are recited. But each of these ways of doing things is a way of saying we honor and recreate the sacred things that allow this dynamism between ice and fire to exist. And one of my favorite ways to recreate this dynamism is to have an actual ritual fire that the offerings go into. This not only recapitulates the creation of fire as sort of like the primary motivating thing that allows everything else to be made, but it also, like the despacho, dispatches these offerings to the spirits, and is an ancient ceremonial and ritual part of our all of our ancestors. So when you're doing this bloat, you frequently call on different spirits that represent the different beings that you're trying to honor, but you may also start out by inviting in these other beings, or reading from the sacred poems, or sharing the blessing, whatever it is, the blessed substances with other people. But each way, what you're doing is saying, it doesn't work for us to fight each other. We're going to like share, and we're going to give and receive offerings so that balance can be maintained. Because in many of the stories, if this doesn't happen, this leads to destruction. So in the bloat, it's like you're trying to reverse that. So in both situations, you have a situation of the ritual correcting something from the creation story that led to destruction. And the ritual is bringing harmony by reminding all of us of this original myth, and also of the importance of reciprocity and negotiation and balance between the different forces that create life. So I hope this is helpful. I'm very happy to answer any questions that you may have, and blessings.